Welcome, everyone. Today I'd like to talk to you about Baja California, sometimes referred to as the Forgotten Peninsula. And this admittedly is a brief overview. Stretching nearly 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers from Tijuana and Mexicali in the north to Cabo San Lucas in the south, Baja California is the longest and narrowest peninsula in the world. In contrast to many other peninsulas, though, it parallels the mainland that it's attached to. And that Sea of Cortez that you see cutting up there on the east side is the end result of the tectonic movements here in Southern California, the San Andreas Fault slowly unzipping towards the north eventually will cause it to slide northward along the main body of North America. We just finished up talking about the southern Alta California southern coast. And in many ways, the northwest coast of Baja California is simply a continuation of that geography, geology, and especially in the San Diego and Coachella Valley area, continues directly into the native worlds of Baja California. And so in many ways, this region should probably be viewed as a unit, the Greater California Bight. But then as we talked about, these culture area concepts end up being blurred in so many different dimensions. You could also connect the San Diego and Coachella Valley area with the human-speaking relatives of southwestern Arizona. And as a result, the clear distinctions about where to define these boundaries ends up being, the response to that ends up being it depends. So for the moment, we'll just talk about this in more indigenous cultural terms, more biological and ecological terms, rather than worrying for the moment about specific political boundaries. Much of the coast of Baja California is incredibly rich in terms of its marine resources, but in terms of agricultural potential, it varies. There are some areas, for example, between San Quintin and El Rosario on the Pacific coast, that actually produce a fair amount, but usually in greenhouse, modern, late 20th, early 21st century agriculture has enabled those regions to produce far more than they would have been able to further in the past. But what is lacking in many areas isn't necessarily the fertility of the soil or the knowledge of agriculture, but it's water. And water exists in Baja California. There are many springs and oases. The Jesuit missions founded there in the 18th century found many of those and built missions in and around them. So the water's there, but not enough to support very large urban centers. Not enough to support any kind of extensive agriculture, again, absent modern well drilling technology to get down to deep aquifers. The surface water is just not there in most regions of Baja California to support agriculture. And as a result, most of the native groups of the peninsula had adaptations that ranged from desert foragers in some areas, but in many areas this was combined heavily, if not exclusively, with very powerful maritime adaptations. And so the fertility of these seas, which is prodigious, is absolutely key to the lifeway of many of the people in Baja California. those native groups that have survived to the present day, in most instances, lost much of their access to the coast. The native people, for example, who live in the mountains east of Ensenada, have lost their direct access to the coast as cities of Tijuana and Rosarito and Ensenada have grown. Their ability to continue that maritime aspect of their lifeway has been impeded. But from the ethnohistoric and archaeological evidence that we have, this was an absolutely essential component to their way of life. For obvious reasons, the abundance of various kinds of fish, almost all of it absolutely delicious, I have to admit. Sea mammals, here you can see sea lions and elephant seals, seabirds, cetaceans. It really is like being inside a National Geographic film when you get down into the portions of the peninsular coast that are well south of the major urban centers of the border region and north of the tourist mecca of Cabo San Lucas. It's really phenomenal. You gain an appreciation for what the landscape must have been like along much of the Pacific coast of North America. And it is a starkly beautiful rocky coastline with small fishing villages interspersed with bird and sea mammal rookeries in a way that is changed only by a matter of degree from the times of John Steinbeck and The Log from the Sea of Cortez. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. The interesting thing, this slide shows a archaeological discovery in northern Mexico, not on the Baja California Peninsula. This is Cueva de la Candelaria, but it is a burial cave of people following very, very similar lifeway to that of the Cochimí and Quiliwa and other groups of central Baja California. And it gives you a very, very clear impression of the importance that, even right here towards the beginning of this, I really want to emphasize the importance of fiber and fabric and rope and cordage in the material culture of these populations. I can't stress that enough. Take special note, bottom right image, that carrying basket there. This here is a representation of chichimecas from the Codex Duran, which is a 16th century Mexico colonial period codex. Look at the bags that these individuals are carrying. They are almost exactly like the one recovered from Cueva de la Candelaria. These are hunter-gatherers, as remembered and recorded by other indigenous populations of Mexico, in this case central Mexico. This was how they represented hunter-gatherers of the north, and they were able to get down even to the level of some of the structures of their carrying baskets. So they were clearly well represented here. Here's another example from an Aztec codex, in this case the Florentine Codex, and shows net fishing. This is really, really important as well, because so often I think when we think of the material culture of native peoples of North America, we tend to overemphasize the lithic components. I say that even as somebody that has an affinity for stone tool technology, but the critical components of production, consumption, carrying, storage, all of that really had much more importance of fiber technology than of the lithics. And we should keep that in mind as we try to understand the lifeways, the ideologies, the cosmologies of these people. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that this landscape is 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 a rugged one. There are not large plains where you see very little topography. In most areas of Baja California, the mountains come right down to the ocean. In some cases, directly coming out of the ocean, as in the case of Cedros Island on the west coast. But it's also a very naked landscape. There is not a whole lot of ground cover, even in places like the Valle de los Cirios, where you have these beautiful cacti forests and incredible boojum trees and all kinds of really fascinating high density Colorado desert flora. There still isn't really much that masks the ground. You can really see the bones of the earth, as it were, as you walk along it. And that comes through in the native stories that we've been reading in the texts. One place that I've done some work is here, as you know, on Isla Cedros at the southern end of the Greater California Bight. And we've located a number of very, very early sites that have some of the earliest evidence for the use of plant fiber technology. We've been able to recover that by doing experimental replicative work along with use-wear analyses of tools that we've recovered from radiocarbon dated strata. So the people of Baja California have been making and using plant fiber technology for at least the last 12,000 years. And the plants that they've been using have not changed significantly either. Agave is probably the single most important plant for native Baja Californians. Here's an example of fiber that we produced experimentally using stone tools and roasted agave leaves. Here are examples of actual cordage recovered from archaeological deposits in central Baja California, in this case on Isla Cedros. And here's the plant itself. This is Agave shawii, and it's a interesting agave. It does a great deal of cloning and so of itself, and so it will grow in these mats where you have a large parent plant and then a number of what are called pups around the base. And so if you're only harvesting the adult plants, the ones that have the big heart that you can roast and eat as an incredible source of starch and carbohydrates, and then the leaves are useful for making fiber, all that rope and cordage and nets. The stalks can be turned into things like quivers or containers. The flowers can be eaten. The seed pods, when they're green, can be turned into soap. The seeds, once they're dry, can be milled and turned into flour. Even the roots are incredibly useful in making basketry. I know it's often said about a lot of things, but literally every single part of this plant is useful and was used extensively by native Baja Californians. If the acorn is something that is key to much of Alta California, and the salmon is a key resource for the northwest coast of North America. Right here you're looking, the agave is absolutely key for Baja California and indeed most of northwest Mexico. And these are some of the fish that they're catching in these great nets, things like smelt, great clouds of these fish. If you have the ability to mass harvest even a small creature, if you can harvest it in abundance, then it can be even more of a essential element to your adaptation than whales. Right? Whales are a lot harder to deal with than sardines. And this process even continues today. Net fishing in small boats by small crews is still a key component of the Baja California economy, even today. And descendants of the native people of Baja California, in this case, Kumeyaay descendant Teresa Castro, showing some examples of agave fiber products that they still produce today. Obviously, here in the 21st century, much of this is for consumption by tourists, but other things are still of practical use and used in people's everyday lives. Carrying nets and baskets, rope is still very useful. Obviously, the footwear that you see there is superseded by more modern footwear in almost every case. But it is still a tradition that is carried on by native people in northern Baja California. And fishing that was important in the past. You can see here fish hooks and scrapers and fin weights and shell fish hooks. These were all important in the past as well and continue to be important today. There's this deep tradition of fishing communities on the peninsula. And you see transitions in that technology. Early on, you see the use of shell as a raw material for the fish hooks, and then later in time, you see them moving to using the spines of golden spine barrel cactus like these, reported ethnographically. I have yet to recover an example archaeologically in Baja California, but in Chile, they have been recovered in some cases, as you can see in the example there on the right, even with the fishing line still attached to them, made out of cactus spines. And so it's a matter of time finding the right preservational contexts, but they're there in Baja California, reported both ethnographically and historically. And when you compare this to the traditions on the northwest coast, there's some important differences, but it's also consistent with these traditions where there are sets of focal resources and focal attitudes and environments that people are exceptionally good at exploiting, materials that they're exceptionally good at working. On the northwest coast, the thing they have in abundance, wood. There's plenty of trees on the northwest coast, and so the ability of the native people on the northwest coast to work wood, bending it, carving it, shaping it, steaming it, is par excellence and second to none in North America. And in Baja California, what is available is quite a bit of fiber from these desert plants. You also see the similarities between Northwest Coast and even Baja California groups is that the ones who have the best access to villages that are well supported with good beach landings tend to have an advantage. And on the Northwest Coast, it was about clustering the houses near areas that had good boat landings that then could access these other resource areas. You didn't have to be right on top of the resources. You had to be able to get to them. And the first part of getting to them would be able to launch your boats, go out, come back, and land your boats effectively. And we see that same pattern in Baja California as well. For the groups that are very specialized and focused towards a maritime adaptation, the thing that's most important is the positioning near good boat landings. And here you can see also along the Pacific coast of North America. This is the south coast of Peru. You see what are called caballitos. These are reed boats, single-person reed boats, and they're using nets to fish, going offshore, not necessarily going to any other place, but getting offshore enough that they're in the cold Humboldt Current with all of its riches and able to access those resources. Baskets, again, key components to even harvesting of shellfish. I know it's been said by some scholars that work in Alta California that harvesting of shellfish does not require much technology, but I actually think they're wrong in this sense in particular, because you may not need a whole lot of technology to be able to remove one mussel from the rocks. But if you're out there and the waves are kind of crashing around you and you're trying to carry back more than one mussel shell, you're going to need a container, and you're going to need one that is easy to carry and one that you can close the lid to so you don't end up spilling all of the shells that you've collected. And that's going to require some kind of container technology, either a bag or a basket. And that's going to require tanning and fiber technology and a whole bunch of other stuff. Even though you're just plucking mussels, there's a whole lot that goes into that planning and process ahead of that practice. And so it's not just as simple as, a generalized primate behavior. You're harvesting for more than just you eating it in the surf out there. You're harvesting this stuff and you're taking it back to an archaeological site. I should say you're taking this back to a residential site that becomes an archaeological site that we then identify. If everybody was just out eating shellfish on the rocks, we would never find these things archaeologically. They had to be transported. And because of that, we know there's more to it than some scholars have proposed. Again, this container technology is something that I think is underappreciated. The occupation of Baja California goes at least as far back as the terminal Pleistocene. I'm going to say we have evidence that it extends back over 13,000 years, without any doubt. The interesting thing is that in contrast to most people's understanding of the peninsula, that it's this desert landscape without a whole lot of people except near the border and near Cabo San Lucas, the evidence that we have for very early occupation is not at all ephemeral or lacking, especially along the coast. Questions people say, was Baja California peopled by sea or by land? Of course, full disclosure, I lean towards a coastal migration model. And regardless of that particular pathway, many of the indigenous legends, especially some of the ones that you've looked at, speak of these migrations from the north. People are coming from the north into the peninsula. We have fluted points indicating that there are either connections with groups further into the interior or people from further in the interior are wandering out to the peninsula one way or another, but that even at this early time, there's not a complete isolation of the peninsula from the adjacent mainland. And we have abundant evidence from numerous sites on the peninsula, in the central part of the peninsula, down near La Paz, even up near the border, for very early occupations. So some of the misconceptions about native groups of Baja California that should be cleared up. One, there's this misconception that they were tiny populations that lived this miserable existence isolated in the desert, right? That there was no social structure larger than the family or the band. That they were primitive technologically and ideologically unsophisticated. These are all wrong. There is abundant descriptions in the Jesuit manuscripts dating from the 18th century talking about large concentrations of people. And many people took those descriptions and sort of thought they were overestimations, were unwilling to believe that because it ran counter to the narrative that they had for this unpopulated desert landscape. The problem is that we have now, from a number of places, both in the southern state and the northern state, ample evidence for large concentrations of people, numbering in the, well into the hundreds of people. This is one village site that has 481 house features mapped archaeologically on its surface. Even if only 10% of those are occupied simultaneously, and even if there's only 3 people living in each house, that's still 150 people living in one village. And that's the lowest estimate that you could possibly make for this place. So, not tiny populations, not living a miserable existence, especially when you remember that so much of this landscape is filled with plants similar to the agave, like jojoba and mesquite and manzanita and wolfberry. It's just full of plants that have economic uses and food uses as well. And the obsidian that they're moving around the landscape, hundreds of miles they're moving this stuff, indicates that the trade networks and the appreciation for different kinds of materials in manufacturing the technologies that they're using is something that is important to people. If you're living so close to the edge of starvation, getting a particular kind of stone to make your tool out of is not going to be something that is going to be so consistent and seen for millennia, persisting for millennia. And the idea of technological primitivism is ridiculous, especially because we see the earliest evidence for sophisticated, specialized maritime resource harvesting technology on the Baja California Peninsula. The oldest in the Americas is here in Baja California. And that technological sophistication in terms of marine resource harvesting and fiber technology and nets and all of that does not end in the terminal Pleistocene. It's definitely something that persists through time. So given the landscape that they were living in and given the resources that they needed to have access to, their technology was as sophisticated as any group in North America. They didn't have ceramics, but they didn't have much need for them either. And there was the amazing rock art that we'll look at here in a second, but there's also smaller objects of artistic value and ornamentation. Harpoons, a ridiculous diversity of harpoon forms and frequency of harpoons. They were very, very, very good at making harpoons out of bone and stone and wood in different combinations. Watercraft, too. Innovating in different ways. If you don't have reeds, you can make something out of wood. If you don't have enough wood, you can make things out of reeds. Depending upon the region, the boat technologies varied. In some cases, they combined elements of design to create unique watercraft forms, such as this one from Isla Cedros. The world of the Cochimí and Pai peoples of Baja California was divided into 4 directions, zenith and nadir. So there's 6 directions, right? North, east, south, west, and up and down. Each world direction was associated with a certain color. In the case of the Cochimí, you have east is white, south is yellow, west is black, and north is red. The world was created by Coyote Luna, Moon Coyote, and is an example of a masculine lunar deity creator. In contrast to some other traditions where you see the association between the moon and femininity and the sun and masculinity, there wasn't that gendered division of those 2 astronomical bodies here in Baja California. Each cardinal direction also had a corresponding mountain, which was both the place where one of the 4 mountain sheep held up the sky on their horns, as well as the cuna or cradle of each of the 4 major clan divisions in society. Shamans held positions of great respect, and among some groups, authority over group decisions. It seems to have varied from group to group how much influence the shamans had. Warfare was not uncommon, in contrast to many depictions of harmonious hunter-gatherers living in peace with nature and each other. But their warfare was nowhere near the intensity that we recognize today. And in contrast to some other groups in North America, it was neither a principal means of acquiring status within society. It happened. It certainly was something people were concerned about. They positioned themselves in defensive locations. But it was more something that people had anxiety over rather than something that was principally celebrated. Here's an example of some of the UNESCO World Heritage Site rock art from the central part of the peninsula. You can see the principal colors being used are black and red in native Baja California ideology. These are colors associated with the ancestors. You see both bighorn sheep, deer, and anthropomorphic figures clearly represented in this particular panel. You see both men and women being represented, as well as children. What's interesting is that one of the key things that seems to vary geographically from specific rock art site to specific rock art site is the nature of the headgear that's being worn by the individuals. In the image that you see on the bottom right, there's a male and a female figure, and they both seem to be wearing the same kind of headgear. This is important because this may be an indicator of clan identity for the people making these rock art panels in different canyons and different mountain ranges of the peninsula. We haven't yet figured it all out, but there is definitely a great deal of symbolism and messaging going on here. What's interesting is that at certain places, such as the Volcanes Tres Vírgenes near Santa Rosalia in central Baja California, the geology itself produces minerals of the 4 world directions. Here you can see red, black, yellow, and white. You can see red of the north, black of the west, yellow of the south, and white of the east, all in the stones there. And this location was also the source of much of the obsidian for the central part of the peninsula, and was a place of pilgrimage, and incidentally was a place where the Jesuits founded one of the largest and most successful of their missions, that of San Ignacio. So there's a connection very clearly made between the actual bones of the landscape that I was talking about earlier and the way that the native people understood it. What's interesting as well is that you have a consistency all the way from the central part of the peninsula all the way up into the San Diego region in terms of certain dimensions of mortuary custom, ritual, religious belief, and the ways in which the supernatural world was created. And so all the way down to areas north of La Paz in Baja California, there's enough evidence, both archaeological and ethnohistoric, to suggest that the native people, the Kumeyaay of the San Diego and Imperial counties, were very close relatives, along with all of the native people of the Colorado River, even up into the Grand Canyon. These were relatives. And one of the ceremonies that is specifically described by the Jesuits and by the documents for the San Diego region is that of the Kumeyaay death image ceremony. These rituals were described by the Jesuits and are clear evidence for continuity in ritual and belief. For Baja California, one of the most remarkable things is that you have an abundance of ethnohistoric documents beginning all the way back in 1540 and continuing up until the late 18th century. And we talked about some of the maps of California during our lecture on the concept of California towards the beginning of this semester. And they are a source of great deal of information about the peninsula, especially because you can see them change over the centuries. But there's also non-missionary groups of the historic period. Pearl diving and smuggling in the Sea of Cortez from the late 15th to the late 18th century. Pirates. There really were pirates off of Baja California. They even caught one of the galleons coming from the Philippines. They caught one off of Cabo San Lucas and burned it to the waterline, stole all the stuff. The crew they put ashore. So there's a great deal of lore about pirates and the Baja California Peninsula. Otter hunters, hunting sea otters for fur to engage with the trade to China. Expeditions beginning in 1805 and going all the way up to 1845, including 2 expeditions brought down by American ships carrying indigenous Alaskan Aleut people that were hired out by Russian agents from the Russian fort at Sitka to the American ships to come down to Baja California and hunt otters. A remarkable example of global trade and exploitation of resources. You have San Francisco Mining Company operations, Chinese abalone fishermen, Japanese abalone divers, the beginning of Mexican fishing cooperatives in 1943, and today in Central Baja California, Mitsubishi Corporation is a major presence there as well. And you can see the evidence of this historic period in the archaeological record as well. Those are gun flints from flintlock muskets, top left. The one on the left there is a French source of flint, and the one on the right is from Brandon, England. Those little pieces of stone have traveled a long, long way to get to the Baja California Peninsula. And bottom right, you can see glass beads, one of the more common historical artifacts that can document this interaction. Unfortunately, we have to talk about the fate of the people of Baja California. The Cape region of the peninsula suffered from both early contact and reprisals following an uprising in the early 1700s. Even before the eviction of the Jesuits, neophytes from other missions were being moved to the Cape region to keep those missions operational. As a result, the Periku, a numerous and distinct group of people occupying the Cape region, were completely gone as a language, ethnic identity, or social unit by the end of the 18th century. Genuinely tragic. The Guaycura, who fared somewhat better than the Periku and were their northern neighbors on the peninsula during the Jesuit period, were recovering from repeated waves of disease when they were effectively swamped by large numbers of colonists and other indigenous groups, many deported from mainland Mexico by colonial officials for resisting in their homelands of Sinaloa and Sonora, following the eviction of the Jesuits in 1769. And the Cochimi, the group that occupied the largest geographic portion of the peninsula, they were also unable to survive the transition from Jesuit to Franciscan and then Dominican mission control over a span of only 10 years. Many of these people were still alive when the Alta California missions were founded, and at least one Cochimi woman from Santa Gertrudis Mission went along with the expedition to found Mission San Diego de Alcalá, and thus she and her children became part of the Alta California mission system. It's entirely probable that there are descendants of Cochimi people still occupying Baja California today. However, as a social unit, as a tribal entity, as people who speak a language that is identifiably distinct, it is very difficult to point to a particular set of people in a particular spot in the Baja California Peninsula and say that they're Cochimi. The surviving native peoples of Baja California, the Kumeyaay, who straddle the border, and we have Kumeyaay groups in San Diego and Imperial counties. There's also large communities of Kumeyaay in Baja California. The Pai Pai, who live east of Ensenada, the Cocopah, who live in the delta of the Colorado River, and the Kiliwa, who live somewhat to the south of them, are some of the tribes that have clearly survived against the odds in Baja California today. So what is left? What is our lesson here? I think one of the key things to understand about the Baja California Peninsula is that it is simultaneously cut off from the rest of the mainland and yet almost stubbornly maintains those connections and attachments. And while that geographic constraint provides a certain amount of clarity to routes of interaction, sources of obsidian, things like that, it has also the ability to focus our understandings of the native concepts of the world, these four world directions, these mountains. And I think it may be possible in Baja California to make the effort to more deeply understand how those aspects of human experience impacted the lives of people on the peninsula. One of the things that you can look at to compare some of the areas that we've looked at, Baja California and Alta California, is this cultural geography. And if you look here at the routes of two sources of obsidian, Arroyo Matomi and Ángel de la Guarda obsidian across the northern peninsula, combined with a number of geographic terrains that make travel exceptionally difficult in some areas. You can see even the route across the peninsula from San Ignacio to Cedros was something that was achievable. But it's because of the importance of these social relations and reciprocal exchange. Even though people had plenty of stone is not something that Baja California lacks, they still exchanged these, which for the groups living on opposite coasts were exotic materials. And that reciprocal exchange between groups that we've talked about as being so important in so many of these different areas of California was very important in Baja California too, even when the absolute economic necessity is not there. And that's why it's important to make the distinction between economic relations and trade. It depends so much on what your options and opportunities are. And if you contrast, for example, Isla Cedros with the northern Channel Islands, you get some interesting results. In central Baja California, you see evidence of trade and exchange even with the Hohokam groups of southern Arizona. You see stylistic similarities between the central part of Baja California and southwestern Arizona. So this connection is more than just pure economics. It's also in ideas about shape and form and style, as well as this reciprocal exchange between neighboring social units. For the Baja California Peninsula, you see places like Isla Cedros that have a relatively high population density and degree of sedentism. On the adjacent mainland, though, you have a much lower density and much more mobile populations there in the central desert, lower surplus production and storage. And also, the coast is everywhere in Baja California. It's exceptionally difficult to get out of sight of it in many cases, especially if there's any elevation at all. And for native people's ability to transit the landscape, it's no more than 2 days' walk from any spot on the peninsula. So things like shells to make beads out of are not necessarily beyond the reach of just about every population. And there's a very shallow potential market for manufactured goods, conditioned by the geographic delimitation of the peninsula as a whole. There's not a whole lot of people who don't have access to the sea. Those that are living on the mainland may not be in very high population densities because of the nature of the central desert. And so you're not going to see the same kinds of economic systems developing in the peninsula that you would further north in Alta California. Because in Alta California, you have a fairly high population density and degree of sedentism on the Channel Islands, although variable. Less so on the southern Channel Islands than the northern ones. There's an even higher population density and sedentism on the adjacent mainland, though. And you have high surplus production and storage. And there's numerous interior populations with valuable resources, obsidian, asphaltum, and they have no direct access to the coast. You have something they don't, and they have something you don't. And so there is the potential synergy of supply and demand happening here in a very Econ 101 kind of sense. And there's a theoretically continental potential market for manufactured goods. Shell beads manufactured on the northern Channel Islands make their way as far inland as Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and the plains of Wyoming. That by itself should be an indicator of the different kinds of options and opportunities that native Alta California groups had when compared to the options that native Baja California groups had access to. At its basic level, Baja California is a remarkable and magical place. There are very few places in the world that are quite like it. It has a great deal of potential, both from the documentation that we have brought down to us, beginning with the Jesuits and explorers, but also because the native people that survive today in the northern part of the peninsula are exceptionally open and willing to share some parts of their lifeway and their culture with us today. It has been a pleasure and honor of mine to have worked there for 20 years. And I sincerely hope that the continued expansion of research by Mexican and some American scholars continues to reveal new things about native language, lifeway, traditions, and that we can turn some of this into a means of providing information and assistance to the native people in Baja California as they struggle to preserve their communities, their traditions, and their knowledge. And I think we're making some good progress. Thank you, and I will talk to you guys very, very soon. Have a wonderful day.